benefit. Yeah, it's a pretty average benefit to get out of Social Security. I think my father's supposed he'll get something like that too when he retired, because he got some estimate of it a year ago.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
I tell your father what Social Security he told me. Take it as soon as you can.
Mm.
So
You
I
mean
took
take
mine
it at the
early.
earliest date, 62?
I took mine at 62.
Mm-hmm.
But that's mine. And I don't know.
I think my grandparents, I think that is my father's parents, they said they're going to wait until they get the maximum amount at 67, because they're already about 65, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to wait till they have the best outcome from it. But yeah, it's an important system to have.
Gosh,
I really hope nothing happens to it.
because you've mentioned FDR.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all of this came from FDR.
Mm-hmm. 1935.
Mm-hmm.
And people back then said it was socialism too. People back then wanted to get rid of it, but they stuck with it.
Those were terrible years. You don't know how terrible this.
I can't imagine the Great Depression. That's something we've
I
read about in history class now, and it's just abject poverty from what we've read. There's people sleeping under bridges, if they can sleep anywhere at all. People found that just starved in their houses because there's nothing left.
No jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
You couldn't make a living.
The actual, there's a measured unemployment rate, there's an actual unemployment rate. If it was 25, the real unemployment rate was almost 50. Something like that. It's.
He started the CCC.
Yep, Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Agricultural Adjustment Authority, whichever one that was.
FA. Yeah. Yeah.
The NRA, not the Rifle Association, the National Recovery Administration.
Mm-hmm.
That was overturned by the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Then Social Security, the FDIC. You had a bank holiday, then you had the FDIC.
My mother and father. I was born in 28. And you know what happened in 29.
Yep.
My father was reasonably successful. He was in Dun and Bradstreet. He had a chain of barbershops throughout Aroostook County. It's way up North Maine, near the Canadian border. And they were doing pretty well. And then the crash came.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to the bank to get their money. The banks were closed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny actually. When I had my interview with Mr. Gibson, I asked him a question about taxes they have to deal with when they go back to vote and stuff. They have to deal with whether or not they're going to raise the tax rate like maybe 3%, on like the highest earners, millionaires and billionaires. Because about 10 years ago, the Republicans cut them in half for the richest folk, and now they have to see if they'll go back to where they were in the 90s. It's something like that. And he made a historical comparison on raising taxes, and he compared it to 30, when Herbert Hoover raised taxes after the crash. He said it was I believe it was actually a set of tariffs. I don't know if it was necessarily an income tax, but it was raising tariffs on a bunch of different items. And Mr. Gibson told me, I guess he must have studied history, he said that was what caused the Great Depression. After the crash, he told me this, after the crash, the stock market rallied and things were getting back to better, things were getting okay again, and things were going to correct themselves naturally, and we're going to get back to employment and all that stuff. Everything was going to be fine until the government got involved and raised taxes, or raised the tariff or something like that, and then everything just fell apart.
Do you believe it?
I don't think that's exactly how it worked, but I haven't studied that particular point in time. I haven't studied
You're going to go back and
following after the... Yeah, I would have to go back and look at how the economy grew or shrank, GDP growth or shrinking, or how the unemployment rate...
by 32, when FDR was elected,
right,
things were pretty bad.
things were awful when he got in. I was reading a book about FDR's presidency, the early presidency, when he came in, because his presidency is the longest one ever, but it was almost on the teetering of anarchy when he was inaugurated. It was people, the bonus marchers that were in Washington, D.C., they had to send out General, was it MacArthur who was it? No, it wasn't MacArthur, it was someone who was a commander in World War I, Pershing or something like that. They'd send out an army commander to put people down from, storming the Capitol, stuff like that. It was desperate. And
Well, they were desperate.
Yeah, it was. It was an extremely desperate time.
They couldn't do anything.
Exactly. But I don't know. I really have to go study like the economics that Mr. Gibson was talking about. But he was making a historical comparison to the Depression, saying the government shouldn't do anything. When I think, from what I've studied at least, and then I guess you were just saying a moment ago, the government did do things, and that did help people, like the CCC, like the FDIC. Unemployment insurance started with the Social Security Act, and welfare and Social Security, all tied up as a bill. There's a lot. You can't measure the amount of things that came out of there. Rural electrification, when people got electricity. There's a lot of stuff in there that you can't even measure. But
And they built
I was interviewing him, so I couldn't talk back. I couldn't have a debate or discussion with him. I'm just listening to what he has to say.
No,
but
that's good. Well, you can go back, maybe.
maybe now this is my congressman, I suppose I would. But
Have you been down to Hyde Park?
no, I want to go to the FDR library
Yeah,
that I heard was down there. Yeah.
because that's where it all came from.
Mhm.
He was Hyde Park through and through.
Yeah,
I think Eleanor pretty much had the Taconic built.
Mhm.
They lived in Manhattan, and she wanted a good road up to Hyde Park.
Yep. When I was at the Hysterical Society, the schoolhouse there, it was a part of the spiel you told people about the schoolhouse was that Eleanor Roosevelt was in that schoolhouse giving a radio address.
When?
When, I don't remember.
What schoolhouse?
The little Ichabod Crane schoolhouse next to the Van Allen house, the little white one.
Where's that on 9?
It's a little one-room schoolhouse. Yeah, it's just down a little bit from the
And
closed.
she gave a radio address from there?
It wasn't she was giving an address. She walked in on a radio program of some sort. I learned the thing to tell people, and there was a very popular radio personality back then who was kind of like the Martha Stewart of back then. I don't remember who it was. I was told, but I forgot the story. But she was doing a radio program. It was kind of like a women's interests program, I think. They told me at least. And I think the First Lady was, I don't know if she was planned to be there, but she was going through there, like you said, because it's one of the oldest roads anyway, postal road there. And but she came through there and she stopped in, because there's like a radio tower there and stuff going on. And so she was on that program. She stopped in that schoolhouse, that very schoolhouse, and she was on a radio program they were broadcasting out of there.
Did you want to make your meeting?
No, I wasn't going to that
Oh, you're
meeting
not going
exactly.
to?
No. And that would have already started anyway.
And she did a lot.
Yeah, she did.
She did a lot.
She's quite a first lady for
And she
England,
certainly was. She went all over the world.
She's essential to founding the United Nations during the war, after the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just a shame that people bury that history.
Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's like what Mr. Gibson was telling me, and people do this now, when we had this big recession, when Lehman Brothers, like we were talking about earlier, Lehman Brothers, the bank, collapsed in 2008, we faced a very real repeat of what happened in 1929. Because if that bank went down,
definitely.
AIG would go down, Goldman Sachs would go down, JP Morgan would go down, Chase would go down. Every one of those companies would fall like dominoes. And that's what happened in the 1920s, was all those banks shuttered, and you would have runs on the banks. In 2008, overnight, when that crashed, people started pulling back, and people withdrew up to like the FDIC's insurance limit. People withdrew all the money, and one of the banks, I think it might have been Goldman Sachs, their reserve to back themselves up literally fell into the negative and bounced back, because it can go by computer, so people can just do it instantaneously. So it literally fell to negative, which is impossible physically, but electronically it went off the map and came back because it was just a big panic. And then that's why they had to bail out those banks, unfortunately, because if you don't do that, what you get is all of them shutting down, and then like what happened to your parents, people go to the bank, they can't get a loan anymore. They can't get anything. They can't get their money, period.
Get their
Right.
money. They
Yeah.
didn't ask for a loan. They just asked for
I
what
know,
they had
but
in the bank.
when you get back to people needing to start businesses and get jobs and buy things, then you also do need loans.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, people that had their money in Lehman Brothers, they were wiped out.
You mean recently?
Yeah. No, when that bank collapsed and is gone, Lehman Brothers ceased to exist. It failed. It's done.
And it's still gone, huh?
It's gone. Yeah. No, it was never it was liquidated.
Lehman Brothers was gone.
Mm-hmm. In 2008, that's what started the whole crash. You know, things were going downhill, but that was the flashpoint that started this crash.
Oh.
But then the government stepped in and signed that giant bailout to prop up the other banks so they wouldn't collapse like that. Which is a shame because you have to do that, but unfortunately, you have to do that to keep them from collapsing. Because if they collapse, then every company and business in the entire country and all the people that have their money in them are really out of luck. Payrolls would be wiped out, companies would be shuttered. You'd see unemployment go up like crazy, way more than it is now. It would look mild now. And then President Obama came into office and signed the stimulus package, the Recovery Act, which did a lot of things like FDR did. It extended unemployment insurance for people. It extended health insurance, unemployment insurance, COBRA for people. It was going to put people back to work building infrastructure. It had billions of dollars in it to build infrastructure like they did in the 30s. It would build roads and bridges and tunnels and things. And it's done a lot of that across the country. Thousands of different projects that they've built. And the unfortunate part is it wasn't enough. It was huge. But economists said it would need to be twice that to get us out of the hole we're in. So what you have is a problem where you spend a whole bunch of money and you avoid having like a 15% unemployment rate, but you're still stuck at a 10% unemployment rate. No one's happy with that. But it's hard to argue a case based on what could have happened because you're stuck where you are. But now people, then when they were passing that, the other side came out against it and said FDR didn't work in the first place. Don't do this at all. They said everything will correct itself. They said we don't need government getting involved. That'll just screw everything up. They said don't spend any money. We don't need this. Spending money's wrong and debt will hurt us all. And the New Deal never worked. The New Deal was terrible. It didn't help anybody. Or no, people say there are people that kind of change or alter, I guess, deny history and say the New Deal caused the Depression. I have an uncle that said this to me when I was talking to him about the economy. He said, the government got involved and that made the Depression worse, and FDR made the whole Depression worse, and the New Deal made things longer and harder and more unemployment. And, I mean, as much as I can study history, you were telling me yourself firsthand that there were things that helped, that there were things that were good. And that's something you rarely can get as someone who can tell you about certain things having effects.
The sad thing is that the economy didn't lift until the war began.
Yes.
And it took the sons of dads and moms, their bodies, to bring the economy back. It was the war effort.
Because the thing was, as much as FDR did to build electrification plants and the Hoover Dam and all sorts of roads and all sorts of things like that, that wasn't, like now, that wasn't enough back then. You had a 25% unemployment rate, it became a 15% unemployment rate, and that's great. But again, like you just said, the economy wasn't coming back until we spent a whole lot of money, and that was the war.
The war.
The war put everyone to work again. And that's not going to happen now, which is kind of why we're stuck.
Prescott, Maine is where my mother and father were, and that's 18 miles south of the Canadian border. There's only a couple towns between it, Fairfield and Van Buren, and they were so down that my father heard of a job in Lincoln, Maine, and Lincoln is a good, well, let's see, it's 180 miles from Bangor to Prescott. Lincoln's about 50 miles from Bangor. It's about 130 miles south. In Lincoln, Maine, he heard of a job as a barber for $7 a week.
Wow.
And he moved the family there.
Did he get the job?
Yeah.
Is that the job? Oh, that's good then.
He moved my mother, my father, and my next older brother, Gordon. Now, that was a paper mill town, the Great Northern Paper, like Millinocket.
Didn't Malaysia used to have a paper mill because of the water there?
Oh, that was paper?
Maybe might have been a different mill, but yeah.
I thought
Used to be a
I
mill
thought it
town here
was,
too.
I thought it was fabric, yeah.
That could actually, you might be right. Might have been textile mill.
Yeah,
Yeah.
textile. And this is funny. So the few people who did have jobs, they worked for the paper mill.
Mhm.
And the Monopoly game came out.
Oh yeah.
And we couldn't afford that, of course. So my dad got a piece of plywood. It didn't fold or anything. And the people from the mill would go to the waste baskets and pick out colored paper. And we would have an old Underwood typewriter. It was terrible to make it. And we would like make blue would be Illinois and Indiana and oh no, those were orange. And then Park Avenue and
Mhm.
yeah. And then we made the little cards, you know, the gold cards. You know.
Yeah.
And so we made it. And we spent all winter on it. A whole bunch of us. Everybody was equally unemployed almost. My mother took roomers. And but we finished that. We finished that Monopoly game. By the end of the winter we could play it. We could all sit around the table and play it. Now that house had no central heating. And it had a kitchen stove. And then it had registers. You know, these little grated iron things. Registers in the ceiling. And of course that didn't heat it. And we used to go to bed, and I'm telling you, it was so cold. And my mother used to put pieces of wood in the stove, in the oven, and we'd wrap a blanket around them. And that way we tried to stay warm during the night. It was fierce.
Yeah, I don't think people today could imagine actually at all what it was like to live through that kind of downturn.
Yeah. And my sister went to Rustic Normal School, which of course became part of the University of Maine, and she became a teacher. And the poverty that she saw was even worse than what we had. The poverty she saw of the children in school. Oh, and my father, here he was a barber. He had a trade. Couldn't get a job as a barber. He took anything. He took selling blankets door to door, made by the Eastern Blanket Company. And he went and sold them out in the backwoods, and they'd buy them on time, 50 cents a week. And they couldn't make the 50 cents a week. And the company made him take those blankets back. Now these are people out in the woods cold. So we got through it.
Yeah. How did your family emerge from the depression then? When things got better, how did you get out?
Well, now we're up to 40 when Wilkie's running.
Mm-hmm.
Wilkie's running against Roosevelt.
Right.
And 41, December 7th was Pearl Harbor. The war was going on in Europe. So Pearl Harbor started, and then America began to realize that there was going to be a war. And so the defense factory started. Well, my father had a brother who was a barber in Worcester, Mass. And Worcester was a lot better than Maine. Maine was really hard hit. And so he went out there to become a barber. And then this grinding of the war came, and my dad took a job in a defense factory. It was the United States Rubber Company in Chicopee, Massachusetts, which later became U.S. Royal, U.S. Rubber. And for the first time in his life, he had money. Well, I mean the first time since 1929, he had money. And he would work as a barber during the daytime, and he would work at night, all night long in the defense factory. Then he was hit with cancer around 1940 in the mouth, in the front third of his tongue. And they couldn't do anything for it in Bangor. Nothing in Bangor, Maine. So they sent him to Massachusetts. And it was terrible. It was radium, and it wouldn't go away. It wouldn't heal. And then Harvard Medical College got interested in his case, and they wanted to see if they couldn't cure it. And it was at the Huntington Memorial Hospital in Boston, which is a Harvard Medical Hospital. And they said we could do a radical, we could remove your tongue a third of the way back on this side, and then we could take out all the glands in your neck and have it drained down here. Well, what choice did the man have?
Yeah, sounds unpleasant.
But they did it.
Mm-hmm.
And they kept him there for 2-3 months. And they let him go home. And they said, come back in a month. Come back in a month. Come back. And pretty soon they'd say, come back in 3 months. Pretty soon they said, come back in a half a year. Pretty soon they said, come back in a year. Then come back in a year. 5 years he was pronounced cured.
Wow.
Isn't that wonderful?
Wow.
It was the radical. It was the surgery
Mm-hmm.
that got rid of the cancer.
Right.
And he did have an awful cut down here, and it's all hollow here. But he learned to talk. He didn't bother him. He learned to talk again. But isn't that wonderful?
That's wow.
But then, as I telling you about working all night long and most of the day, guess what he died of? When even after he was cured of cancer 10 years later, he died of an aneurysm because he overworked his heart. He died of an aneurysm he was 72. But that was it. He, the first time they had money, he just couldn't pass up the opportunity to learn it.
Right. That seems like the way that generation coming out of the Depression worked.
Yeah.
Was going through that much hardship. You never took anything for granted again.
That's right.
And then I think the generation that bore after that, the baby boomer generation really,
Yeah.
did exactly the opposite. Had everything given to them.
Yeah.
And had America as it stood and all the opportunity you can get in it. They expected it, I think. And I think they've slowly cut it away.
Would that be the 50s and the 60s?
Well, I think the baby boomers, the way they're defined at least, were born in the 50s and the
Yeah,
60s.
during
Born
the
in
war.
the 50s.
They were
After
After
the war
war.
till about, so from probably the end of the war till the 50s sometime, yeah. And the 60s is probably a different generation, historically.
What were they? The 60s.
The 60s were, my parents were born in the 60s, but they weren't necessarily living through the 60s. I don't know what they're defined as, really. It's not the baby boomers. The baby boomers is what's born after the war by the returning, everyone returning from the war, everyone coming back home and changing back to normalcy. But
Yeah, they came home from the war. Boy, things were booming. When they came home from the war, buildings were going up.
that was probably the golden age for the country at this point.
You think so?
It's probably post-World War II.
That's when the United States went over to Japan and started Japan Victor, which is JVC, which is
Mhm.
RC. No, it wasn't RC. JVC. RCA Victor, yeah. It was RC. They encouraged all these and
Right. Yeah, we had to
Sony,
rebuild
Panasonic.
Japan. Yeah, we
Mhm.
had to rebuild Germany. We had to build nuclear weapons.
Oh, I remember. You don't remember. I was a waitress. We went through college. That's how I got through college. I would go away to summer resorts and wait on table to these rich people.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that so well, August, when Hiroshima.
What did you see of Hiroshima then? 'Cause what would they let you see back at home? Was it actually well known what had happened? Was
Oh boy, was it well known, yes.
were there images? Did people actually see
I imagine,
what
yes.
became of the city?
I imagine, yes. Terrible. Terrible. And that was in August and the war was over.
Yeah.
And when Franklin went, Franklin was in D-Day.
Was he?
Oh yeah, he was in, he was drafted, or was he drafted or enlisted? Which was it? Right before, just before Pearl Harbor. Yeah, he was drafted.
Probably draft. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was probably the only time we ever had a pre-war draft.
Oh yeah?
It was in 1940. Yeah.
And he was sent to Devon, Camp Devon. And the one down in New Jersey, the one that's so famous in New Jersey. And then, because he had gone to secretarial school. His father was a mathematics teacher in high schools, secondary schools. And he decided to go to secretarial school, and he did well. He worked for Trumbull Electric, Trumbull, Connecticut. And Trumbull was a governor of Connecticut. And it was later all bought up by General Electric. But he worked for them as a secretary to Mr. Trumbull. So when he got into the Army, all of the generals fought over him because he could take shorthand and he could type. And they needed that. So they were all fighting over him. And then he got transferred, went on the Queen Elizabeth.
So, yeah, how did he end up in Normandy then?
Well,
He was working secretarially and then he was drafted?
say again?
He was working as a secretary and then he was drafted?
He was drafted when he was.
When he was in the service, he was doing secretary work.
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
But then he was drafted.
No, he was working as a secretary, and then he was drafted, and then he
Okay.
goes into the Army, and then all of the generals want a secretary.
Oh.
Oh, so they wooed him as best they could to get him, and he ended up in the adjutant general's office, and they sat in Bristol, England, for
Right.
a long time.
And that's when we built up for the invasion.
And D-Day was supposed to be June 4th.
Mm-hmm. They had a storm.
Bad.
It's strange, we were just learning about this the other day. I have a U.S. History at War class,
Oh yeah.
and we've gone through the First World War, and we're into the Second World War, and we were just studying Normandy the other day, and we were talking about that.
Wow.
It was supposed to be 2 days in advance. There's a terrible stormy on the channel. So that's why
June
Normandy's
4th.
June 4th, yeah, but that's why Normandy's carved out, and we wanted to hit that spot in there because we were hoping the waves would, the sea would be blocked out by that part of the channel.
Well, he sat in a ship in the English Channel for those 2 days.
Mm.
And the meteorologist said it wasn't going to get better. And there were 13 generals. And it was 6 to 6 to go on the 6th or not. And Eisenhower cast the deciding vote. And so that's how he went to Normandy.
Was Franklin there on June 6th? He went ashore in the beginning?
No, after June 6th, of course.
Oh, he went ashore after they taken the beach then?
Yes.
Okay, so he was probably June 7th to follow up, something like that.
And he had an awful job. His job was to send in the new ones. The names of the new ones to go in. So he did, and he went over France, got into Belgium, and this was an interesting thing. They were in Belgium, and all of a sudden they saw the Yanks coming north, going west, when they should have been going east to Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? The Battle of the Bulge.
Out of the boat, yeah.
The weather again. The Yanks couldn't get the supplies through.
Yep.
And, but then the weather broke, and that was the last hurrah of the Nazis.
Yep. That was the last push.
And he
That
said,
was all downhill.
his birthday was June 3rd, by the way. And he said that if you had told me that I would be home a year from June the 6th, he says, I would never have believed you. But he was.
Oh, good, he wasn't
Victory in
redeployed.
Europe Day was June what?
May 5th.
You sure? You sure it wasn't June?
It usually happens right before my birthday, so.
Oh,
I do
Victory in
remember.
Europe Day?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it was in May, yeah.
And he came home.
Because Hitler killed himself shortly after his birthday. And
What?
Hitler killed himself shortly after his birthday, and that's in April.
How do they know he killed himself? They never found anything.
The Soviets found his skull. They set him on fire after they killed himself.
They what?
The Soviets found his skull, and they had to identify him by his teeth.
Where? In Berlin?
And yeah, there's a bunker under the Reichstag. There's the Chancellor building right in the center of Germany. There's a Nazis had a bunker under there, which is where the last of the last were held out, and that's where Hitler married that woman and then killed himself.
By gunshot, do they think?
I think there's a lot of stories into this. People
Yeah.
studied it extensively. He took a cyanide capsule, and then shot himself. He wanted to make sure. He's a little paranoid. Both of them killed themselves too. So. Actually, a lot of people in there killed themselves. Because the Russians would have been brutal to them.
Oh.
The Russians were brutal in general, especially in Berlin.
Franklin's father, one of the places where he taught mathematics was the Berry schools down in Georgia. Martha Berry was a plantation lady, and she had considerable money, and she always felt bad for the youth in the woods of Georgia who never had any schooling.
Mm-hmm.
So she started the Martha Berry schools, and she would take these boys and educate them, and she had a number of people. She was very good at raising money, and she called them her pilgrims. One of them was Harvey Firestone and Mrs. Firestone. Another one was Henry Ford and Mrs. Ford.
Wow.
And she was very good at getting them to come to the campus and raising money. And Mr. Buell, Franklin's father, always had a Dodge. And he had a new Dodge, a 1934, I think it was, Dodge. And Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ford came to the campus, and Mr. Buell drove Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ford around the campus in their Dodge. Isn't that funny? Because the Dodge was made by the Dodge brothers.
Right.
It wasn't Chrysler then, it was the Dodge brothers.
And then do you remember then the whole Cold War aspect of the nuclear buildup and all the frights and
Oh,
the drills and things like that?
And Gorbachev?
Yeah. Slamming his shoe.
Yes, and Cuba?
And the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
That was nearly
Jack
the end
Kennedy.
of the world. Did it seem like that at the time?
I guess I didn't know enough about it. No, tell me about it.
Well, what happened was that the Soviets were in cahoots with the Cubans after Fidel Castro overthrew the government there and made it a communist nation. And yeah, it wasn't Gorbachev, it was Khrushchev. It was installing missiles. Yeah, but it was installing missiles there, nuclear missile silos in Cuba.
Headed for the United States?
Which, from there, from Cuba, it could hit the entire United States. Except for maybe, like, Oregon. But from there, it could hit the entire United States with missiles. And, Kennedy's generals said, bomb it. They said, just firebomb all of Cuba. Bomb it flat. Or invade it. Send troops ashore and invade Cuba. And anyone would figure that would start a war with the Soviets. Because they had ships going in every day. They had guys building the the Soviets were in Cuba building missiles and stuff. So if we attack that, most people would figure that kind of be war with the United States and the Soviet Union. And that would mean nuclear war. That would mean all the missiles fly. That would mean the bombers go, and I don't think the submarines were around at the time, but that would mean the nuclear weapons fly, and that would probably be Armageddon. That would be, at least there would be, cities, most of civilization just wiped off. And that could have happened right there with that turning point, but Kennedy said no. Kennedy did a blockade and just told the ships to turn around and leave. And they did, they stood down and slowly diffused that situation. They had a line from Washington to Moscow, like a red phone, like an emergency kind of line to negotiate something like that. Or at least they did after that event. But
in the blockade, how did he get away with that?
Kennedy sent the Navy out and blockaded the entire island of Cuba. And the Soviets were coming in, and we ordered them to stand down. I guess we radioed them and said we're quarantining this island, and if you're going to go, we're going to fire on you. Which itself could have started a war too, but then the Soviets turned around and left.
And why didn't they let the missiles go then? They weren't ready?
No, I guess it was negotiated that we would not shoot each other down. We blockaded it and said, stop going to Cuba, and they turned around and left. And yet Kennedy had to work things out with Khrushchev to get him to turn around and take the missiles out of Cuba. there were certain deals that we would take missiles like out of Turkey, out of Greece, out of some other countries on their border, and they would take missiles out of Cuba. But the first reaction of the generals was to bomb the whole place and to invade, so the wiser minds prevailed, I guess.
Yeah.
But no, that's probably, at least from, I'm a big history study, so throughout the Cold War that was probably the closest flashpoint that historians cite as almost a rising nuclear war.
Gorbachev really did try to work things out.
Yeah, yeah. Gorbachev really changed the country. Gorbachev tore down the Soviet Union. He changed things,
What
and
caused his
the whole thing
enlightenment?
sort of... I think Gorbachev wasn't trying to be, a dictator like, a lot of the Soviet leaders before him. He genuinely wanted to make the country better. He could see that it wasn't working the way it was going. It was a closed society that was going nowhere and collapsing. And he wanted to change that for the better, to get some things going, to let people speak freely, to get people to open up to the world. But once you pull the string, the whole thing started unraveling. The Soviet Union. So, I mean, their economy was shrinking greatly, and people were slowly losing everything they had. I mean, the country was running out of money. So eventually, he starts going in and making reforms that suddenly people can speak their minds, suddenly people can, petition their government, suddenly people can protest, and all over Eastern Europe, all the countries there in the Soviet bloc started protesting and rising up, and it was up to him if they were going to go in again like they did in Hungary and put tanks in the streets. But he said no. He said if they want to be free, they can be free. And that's how Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, Albania, all fell. And then other countries broke off from the Soviet Union after that, in 91. They broke down the wall in 89, and all that.
I just got a telephone call yesterday from Kathleen Hegedus that her husband had died, and he was in the Hungarian Revolution.
Really?
Oh yeah.
In 1956, I think it was.
55, 56.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and he had fought in it. And he had fought hard, but they couldn't do anything.
Right. Yeah, that was
So?
brave and defiant. Yeah.
Hmm?
That was brave and defiant. Yeah.
Oh, it certainly was. What odds?
Yeah.
I have a video from the archives that we were working on around 89, 90, 91 of Gorbachev and Mrs. Gorbachev and Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan having a conference and it was televised in Moscow, and it was that effort to try to get together and get over the Cold War. Well, the Cold War was no fun either. And then came Vietnam.
Yeah, then Vietnam was in there, yeah.
And
Vietnam must have been something else.
that was terrible because I was a graduate student in physics when that was going on, and the students were so upset with that.
Yeah. No, our history teacher told us stories about, he was about 20, 30 when Vietnam was going on.
Yeah.
And he was in, I forget, he was in a state school, I think somewhere in the state. He was in New York somewhere. And he went up there one weekend, he went up to, I guess he was away for a vacation or something. But he came back after the vacation was over, and he went to drive up to his campus, and the students had taken over the campus.
Yeah.
And he just said, okay, and just turned around and left. And I think he came back like a week later when they put that down. But people were like, I think he said people like set fire to one of the buildings.
What?
I think he said that people set fire to one of the buildings or something like that in the campus.
Oh, they did a lot, yeah.
Yeah, that was something else.
Yeah, and I was on the campus at that time. I can tell you what year that would be.
Somewhere probably in the late 60s, right?
Wow.
67, 8, 9.
I would say 66, 67.
Yeah, that
Oh,
was...
they had taken over the campus. They did at the State University of New York at Buffalo. That's where I was. The Main Street campus.
That was a brutal war. A senseless war.
Oh, yeah. Now, my brother Gordon, he joined the Marines right about 40, 41. And he ended up in Bougainville, in the South Pacific. And that was terrible.
The Japanese were more fierce than the Germans. They were really. They never gave an inch. The
No.
Japanese, they were
Well, the
suicidal.
suicide quads.
Yep.
Now Rodman Henry, Dr. Rodman Henry, Gregory was mentioning him the other day when we went to Pittsfield. He's in Pittsfield, Dr. Henry. I think he has 2 PhDs. Anyway, he was in the Rangers, and the Rangers go behind
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
enemy lines.
Yeah.
Well, he was in Italy, coming up, coming up Italy. And it was around 41, 42. And he got shot at, and the shot hit a hand grenade, which they hold, the hand grenades were here. Hit the hand grenade, and he tried to get it off, and to this day, this hand is really all crippled. This hand, it doesn't exist anymore, he has a hook.
Oh.
And both legs are still oozing blood.
Oh.
I should call Dr. Henry and see how he's doing. Anyway, he wanted to be a cellist. That was his dream. And,
Yeah, I was not gonna get him.
and so you see what that did to him. So he went into art history.
Oh, that's why he came in so wet.
Oh, poor baby. Oh, poor baby. Oh, you poor baby cat. Here, let me put some heaters on. So there's that man to this day,
Yeah.
all shot to pieces.
Did anybody you know ever end up, at least in Europe, end up liberating any of the concentration camps? And those soldiers must have had the most unfortunate duty.
Oh, yeah. No.
Well, it's probably lucky then, yeah.
I remember very well the story of, who was it
Get off there.
that,
Hold it, get off.
who was the one who went into Japan and tried to bomb them and they ran out of gas?
Doolittle.
What?
Doolittle?
Yeah, Jimmy Doolittle. Yeah, I remember his story, and those 3 poor fellas that came down, they never killed them. The Japanese never killed them.
No. They escaped somewhere in China. Or maybe Russia.
No, they didn't escape. They were there until the end of the war.
Oh, okay. They were captured somewhere in China then.
Yeah.
Yeah, they must have gone down somewhere near Chile. Right out of Japan.
Yeah. They bombed the city, so
They did. They got in there.
they got in there, they did it, and then
That
they
was our
turned
first-
around to go home,
That was our first strike then. Yeah.
and they, what do you think about FDR? You think that they provoked the Japanese?
I think FDR did want to get into the war to help Churchill, to help the British. He wanted to beat the Axis, but I don't think he was intentionally goading them into attacking us. But I think he was doing everything in his power to try and stop them. He put embargoes on them and stuff like that. He tried to limit Japan's trade with the United States, which ended up being what got them to attack us, though, because we cut off their oil supply from the United States. I don't think it's like a conspiracy that he wanted them to attack and he knew they were coming. But they did do whatever they could to stop them, so Japan did attack. Because if we knew they were going to attack, we wouldn't have gotten caught that flat-footed.
We would have what?
Wouldn't have gotten caught that flat-footed. Almost our entire navy was destroyed at Pearl Harbor.
Oh yeah, yeah.
FDR is probably one of my political heroes.
Really? Well, you've got to get down there to
Yeah, I want to see that. Yeah,
Hyde Park.
no one.
It's interesting, that Hyde Park also, Vanderbilt lived in Hyde Park. His mansion's in Hyde Park. They're right there on Route 9, both of them. And I was wondering if those two ever went to each other's houses for dinner or anything.
I don't know. Roosevelt knew and met a lot of people. Well, I was wondering, did anybody into the 12 years or so Roosevelt was president, no more, almost 16, 15 years Roosevelt was president. Did anybody outside the White House, did anyone out there know that he actually had polio?
Oh yeah.
Everyone knew that?
Well they kept it as long as they could.
Right.
And they always shot him from the waist up.
Right.
No, they kept it.
He'd be in his car, or he'd be behind a podium, or he'd be standing with the leg braces and he wouldn't really know it, and someone would be at his side and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, they did.
When did everyone learn that then?
Toward the end they began to.
That was probably after, that was in the war then, and after that, yeah.
Yeah, he had a massive hemorrhage.
Yeah.
And I remember that day very well. That was in April.
When he died?
Oh yeah, I remember that day.
April 25th, I believe.
Yeah. Oh, I remember that day.
Well, that must be like the day people remember when Kennedy got shot and 9/11 and stuff like that, to remember.
Oh yeah. I remember that day when Roosevelt died.
What were people
you can see
like?
why he had a massive hemorrhage with what was on his mind.
Yeah.
And that was what, 46?
45.
Well,
Just before the war ended. He didn't live to see VE Day.
he didn't see VE Day.
No.
But he did, and he didn't live to see, it was Truman who dropped the bomb.
Yep.
What do you think about that? You think Truman was right?
I don't know, really. I mean, the argument was that he ended the war, which would have cost us another 2 years probably, invading Japan and going through all that suicidal attacking, and we'd probably have to kill every person in Japan just to get through it. Because they would arm children and women and all sorts of horrible stuff. But then again, using a weapon like that against the civilian population, it's probably the hardest choice we probably ever made in a war.
Hardest choice, what, the atomic bomb?
Yeah. It's hard because if you were to measure it in numbers, going through Japan would be horrible. But looking at that, it's also horrible. So.
That certainly ended it.
Yeah, that definitely put an end to it. Well, the
That
first
was
one happened, and the Japanese thought, well, they can't possibly have another one.
What?
The Japanese were ready to keep going after the first bomb.
The atomic bomb?
Then they hit him with Nagasaki. Then there was a second bomb.
And what was Hiroshima?
That was the first. We dropped 2 atom bombs.
Was it an atom bomb or a hydrogen bomb?
It was an atom bomb. Hydrogen bombs were invented in the 50s.
Oh.
That was a Cold War, Soviet Union, United States kind of thing. Hydrogen bombs are many, many hundreds of times more powerful.
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah, that would have wiped a section of Japan off the map.
I remember in the war, they had us open the top of the tin can, and then you open the bottom of the tin can, then you took your foot.
And crushed the tin
Mhm.
can for
So it was
scrap
flat.
iron, for scrap tin.
Oh yeah. And then you'd go to the grocery store and you were rationed. And
Yeah, you had ration cards.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And you'd stand in line.
Yeah.
Mhm. And the best of the country was in that war. The youth,
The greatest
all
generation.
the young men. Oh, all the young men were in there. And I remember Charles Wolcott, Anna, and Ernest Wolcott came from the White Mountains, way up in the sticks in New Hampshire, and they came down because of the war. They went to work for Westinghouse in Springfield because of the war, to get money. And Charles Wolcott, the youngest boy, there were 5, he could ski coming from the White Mountains, and he really knew how to ski. So they put him in the ski group, and Switzerland, they never heard from him again.
Oh.
They don't even know what happened to him, missing in action.
Wow.
MIA, missing in action.
Now you lived in the north, though. You said Maine, down here to New York, Massachusetts, that area, New England. But all the way through the 60s till we had institutionalized segregation in a lot of the country. Did you ever see anything like that? Did you ever witness?
Explain to me what you mean by that, institutionalized segregation.
Well, in the South, they had all the Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. You know, whites and blacks separate. You know, the separated whites only, coloreds only, that kind of thing. You probably
Okay.
wouldn't see that up
And
here, but
Well, in Maine, you didn't have black people.
I can actually kind of imagine.
But now we go to Massachusetts. And I arrived in Massachusetts when I was 14, a freshman in high school. And Springfield, Massachusetts was known all over the country for the Springfield Plan, which was a school integration.
Right.
And that's the first I knew of. But and did we have blacks in high school and junior high? I mean, in a classical high school. Classical high school was exactly that. Everybody went there, took the college course. Because everybody from classical went to Yale, went to Harvard, went to the Wesleyan or Columbia. They went all to the Ivy League.
Mm-hmm.
And the women all went to Smith, and Mount Holyoke, and Wellesley, you know, those colleges. So I don't think we had black people in high school. But there were a lot of black people in the city, and they were trying to deal with it.
Yeah. Was there like racism and stuff like that? Was there
It was certainly an issue.
Yeah.
It was an issue.
Because I know it wasn't the law up there to have like full segregation, to have separate facilities and stuff, but there's probably a cultural separation.
They were coming in very fast. The blacks were coming in very fast.
Mm-hmm. From the south?
Wherever they came from.
Okay.
Probably from the south,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And you saw all that go on there with the civil rights movement in the 60s, Martin Luther King and the March on Washington and all that, and
Certainly.
the hoses in Alabama
Certainly.
and the dogs. Yeah.
But I never saw any racial conflict at all,
Well, that's
either
fortunate.
in college or in high school. This is an interesting thing. Franklin, when all of the generals told Franklin, they said, you watch, he says, you watch very carefully, he says, after the war, the government's going to make some provision to send veterans to college. Sure enough, they did the GI Bill. And so Franklin went to Boston University.
On the GI Bill?
Yes, he did. And he went and they were great in those days for the accelerated plan, where they went to school in the summertime. They got through in 3 years instead of 4.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in the first graduating class of the School of Public Relations, Department of Journalism, Boston University. And his class would be 48. And guess who was in that class? Martin Luther King Jr.
Really?
Really, he was in the School of Theology.
Oh, right. He was starting to become a minister, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That must be another day to remember.
Yeah.
When he was killed.
Oh, yes.
Actually, a lot of the days in the 60s, I remember, must have been when people were killed.
Yeah. And also the governor of Alabama, wasn't it? The governor of Alabama was
Yeah, it was one of them.
He was assassinated. He was shot.
He was shot like on the floor or something like that. He was in the governor's building of the legislature and was shot.
And then Robert Kennedy.
Mm-hmm. What were people like after all of those? Was it a big national mourning? Kind of
For a selected few.
for people that knew of it.
Yes, and coverage of television, and and people would call up other people, like who was a church secretary at the Asbury, Delaware Methodist Church in Buffalo. She called me up and told me that Kennedy had been shot. That was an awful thing. Who do you think did that?
I don't know.
Do you think it had anything to do with the international bankers?
I don't think it's a banker thing. I think it was a CIA mafia thing.
You do?
Well, John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were both working when he was in office against the mafia. They were big on cracking down the mafia. And, yeah, supposedly there were ties and links between the mafia and people in the CIA. And Kennedy was also trying to dismantle the military-industrial complex.
He was trying to what?
The military-industrial complex, the big vested firms in building armament, the Cold War, stuff like that. The
Yeah, sure.
military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about. And Yeah, no one will really know then.
Do you think it had anything to do with his money solution? He sort of had us against the central bankers, against the international bankers.
I don't what money solution?
Yeah, he had sort of some. Was it the greenback or what was it? Or was that Abraham Lincoln who had the greenback?
Yeah, I don't remember that.
No, he had some sort of a money solution to get us free of the international bankers. That's an awful period in history when Woodrow Wilson signed that. And he said at the end, he says, that's the thing I regret most about my life, when he signed the Federal Reserve bill.
Yeah.
Now and the income tax bill came out at the same time.
Yes, that was during.
Because who's going to pay for
right
this?
there during the war, something like that. That was World War One.
1918.
Yeah, paying for the war was part of the income tax.
And
because that affected like a tiny sliver of the people back then. Cause there was no
they used to
yeah.
laugh about it. It was 1 cent a year.
Right.
Look what it grew into. Well, they used to laugh. I remember when that came in.
You remember when that came in?
Well, I remember people
Later on.
in the 30s,
Yeah.
talking about their income tax.
Well, Roosevelt.
Laughing about it.
Yeah, well, Roosevelt actually, when Roosevelt was in charge, the income tax on the highest earners was like 90%. It was a soak the rich kind of thing
Yeah.
to pay for the New Deal and stuff they were doing. Yeah, and it was like that all the way through. Like Eisenhower was still like 90%. Today it's like 30, 35, something like that. I think we can afford to let that go back up. I'm okay with the rich getting taxed a bit.
What?
I'm okay with the rich getting taxed, but I think it can go back up to 40. But that's what Mr. Gibson was telling me about. That's where this conversation started. They're gonna let the income tax go back up to 40. President Obama said we can't really afford to keep giving them tax breaks. You know, because if they keep it the way it is, it's effectively giving everyone that makes over $1 million would effectively be getting an extra $100,000 in the next 10 years. And that's why we have big debts. Because they don't pay taxes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Uh,
That was President Reagan starting that whole thing.
Now the income tax bill was only ratified by 3 states, so it really isn't a law.
It's an amendment to the Constitution. There's an amendment to the Constitution that allows for the income tax. It's the I knew it. It was not 14th. That's something more important.
The IRS?
The 17th Amendment? No, maybe, because the 19th Amendment came in 1920. So before that, it's either the 17th or the 18th Amendment. Because the 19th Amendment's women's right to vote.
Jim
Something
Donovan,
like that.
he resigned. Oh, he didn't run again, that's what it was. He wanted to retire. But he's now in charge of the sidewalks, putting in sidewalks in Kindlewood.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that the people who had sidewalks in front of their house had to shovel the snow.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, Jim, that's against the 13th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, involuntary servitude. And all he said was, Vester, I'm glad we're not putting a sidewalk in front of your house. Now look at him, he's almost dry.
Still raining?
Here, let me put a light on for you.
Yeah. You gotta carry some of the stuff to the car, but it's raining. So.
Yeah, why don't you just wait 2 minutes? It takes us, I don't know why it takes us like 2 minutes.
I'll tell you, know what I'll do? I'll pull the car into the driveway.
Yep, that's good, but wait till you get the light. Because it's bad out there.
Yep.
Well, that's good. So to answer your question about racial discrimination, it never troubled me. Through all my years, it never was an issue.
Well, you came out 20th century pretty lucky.
No, it
That was
never
a big
was.
thing. Yeah.
And it isn't today.
No, I don't really think so, no. Yeah, that's probably one of the moments for my generation then is, well, we had 9/11. We have kind of the war in Iraq. You have this recession here, or crash, and then electing a black president. that so far.
When is the crash, the date of the crash, this most recent one?
Lehman Brothers collapsed on September 15th, 2008. So that was, I do remember that as I was coming back to school, September. We were just starting like the first week of school. There it is. And I remember, seeing the news on in the kitchen and hearing about banks failing, the economy reeling, the stock market crashing. And we knew almost from there, this is a big one.
But isn't Lehman Brothers, he was an international banker, and so was Goldman Sachs. You know, on the Federal Reserve Act,
A bunch of banks, more than just Lehman completely collapsed and was dissolved and no longer exists and was wiped out. But a lot of other banks were going under, they were just bought up by other banks. The reason it's JP Morgan Chase now is that Chase collapsed, similar to Lehman. It was going under, it was going bankrupt, and JP Morgan came in and bought it. So Chase doesn't exist anymore, it's just an asset of JP Morgan. It's not that they died, but their remains were bought up by a bigger bank.
in the part of the Federal Reserve bill was that the Federal Reserve Bank could never be audited.
It can be now.
Yeah.
They actually, when over the summer when President Obama signed the financial reform bill, something included in that bill gives the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, that does all the audits of public funds in the government, they can audit the Federal Reserve.
And then another part of it that.
I think that was something. You're right. That was part of the stipulations of creating reserves that it can't be, because then you would tangle with financial policy, with monetary policy, because the Constitution gives Congress the authority to set monetary policy, which they then delegated to set up a central bank for. Because that bank sets up the interest rates behind all the other banks.
By the way, when you want to stop this, all you do is hit return. And part of the bill was that they should never know who was on the board.
Well, we know who's on the board of Federal Reserve now, too. We do know who that is. There's a board that's set up between different Federal Reserve branches. Because the actual Federal Reserve Bank doesn't exist as a single entity. It's a bunch of different banks across the country.
Yes, it is.
It's in Kansas, Texas, North Carolina, or South Carolina, I think, New York, some on the West Coast, I think as well.
Yes, and
It's not its own entity,
but some enterprise. This is, around the 20s and 30s. Some enterprising Americans went over to Switzerland. They found out who was on the board. It's Rockefeller. Is that a cat want to come in or?
No, I was just twisting. Oh, here's a cat, but I was just twisting the doorknob.
Come on, honey. Come on, baby. Rockefeller. Goldman Sachs. Lazard Frere. And I think Lehman Brothers.
I wonder if I can find
And of course Rothschilds.
Board of Federal Reserve 2010 comes on today.
Rothschilds.
Yeah.
There's one interesting thing I want to tell you. These Khazars, not Cossacks, Khazars, Khazars, came out from around like Mongolia and migrated into Eastern Europe and then into Central Europe, and then they went down into Jerusalem. And they adopted the Hebrew religion. They adopted it. They were not Hebrew. They were
Right.
like gypsies.
Yep. That'd be Mongolian, yeah.
And they are the ones who were the money changers in the temples that infuriated Christ.
Right.
And when Christ comes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, triumphant, within either Sunday or Monday, he upset those money tables. Well, that made the Khazars infuriated. And so that's when Christ began to go downhill. They arrested him on Thursday with no charge. He really had no charge. against him. And then there was the trial, and then there was the crucifixion. And it was the money changers who really got him, who conspired with the elders of the nation and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And it was really the money changers who catapulted this all. And these Khazars went up to Germany, and that's where they put out the shield. That was a red shield, and that was, you got the Rothschild, that means red in German, Roth, and Schal was shield, and that was a Rothschild. And they took over the bank in Germany, which is now the Deutsche Bank. And then they took over the Bank of France, that would be the Lazard Frere. And then they took over the Bank of England. And then they came to the United States. Andrew Jackson chased them out, who was president for Martin Van Buren. Andrew Jackson chased them out, the central bank. They came back in again. Lincoln was trying to get rid of them, and was making progress. But that, I think, we have to deal with. It's the bankers, the international bankers.
We're dealing with them.
Now, you got everything? This is to go to,
Yeah, let's go to Berkshire.
and you want me to?
I'm going to carry this with me out of the car and bring the car in.
Alrighty, and I'll carry this up for you.
No, you don't have to. It's raining. I'll bring the car over here.
Okay, you want something over this? Yes, I do. It's okay, baby. It's okay. It's okay, honey. It's okay. Come on back. No, don't go out, honey.
Oh, nice. He's around the side now.
She'll come back in
Yeah.
as soon as you go. Thank you very much.
Yep.
I'll see you Thursday at 4. Thursday at 4.
Yep.
Well, you got more stuff?
Yeah, no, the DVDs and my papers are still over there.
Oh, okay.
All this
Oh,
stuff
wait,
too.
let me give you a...
No, the car's right there. It's fine. I'll be in the garage and we'll get inside. It's fine. All right.
Okay, thanks.
It was a lovely conversation there.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
Yep.
Take care of yourself.
Yep. See you on Thursday.
Yep.